Beethoven, I gotta hear it again today. You know my temperature rising, the jukebox blowing a fuse. My heart beating rhythm and my soul keeps singing the blues. I roll over Beethoven, tell Tchaikovsky the news.
Oh man, roll over Beethoven indeed. Chuck Berry, 1956, that song, 69 years ago. Chuck Berry was making a prediction, a bold prediction about where music was headed at the time. We learn, of course, from the past, and then as we progress, we catapult it into the future, and certainly rock and roll music was that catalyst. Again, the great Chuck Berry from 1959. He's going to start us off today as we celebrate Black Music Month. And it's kind of an oxymoron to me that we actually celebrate Black Music Month, because every month is Black Music Month if you think about the fact that everything we listen today derived from the Black musical traditions and experiences in the United States. So Black Music Appreciation Month was first the construct of Jimmy Carter in 1979. He proposed setting aside June for Black music appreciation. And in the year 2000, Congress did that. They voted to approve the Black Music Appreciation Month for June. So as we think about American music, we have to think about the Black experience in America, because that's where the music really grew from. Since the beginning of colonization, music and song formation has been a preservation technique for African culture. Slavery was a significant part of Black music's origins and its historical evolution, as Africans were able to maintain their stories of culture through the language of songs. In the 1600s and 1700s, they maintained their culture through tribal chants, language, religious beliefs, and emotional expression. The development of Black music occurred during and after the period of slavery, and by the late 19th century and early 20th century, Black musical traditions formed the basis from which gospel, jazz, and blues music were born. Black Music Month recognizes their development into genres such as pop, rap, jazz, soul music, funk, hip hop, and just about every other genre of music that we listen to today. So again, we're celebrating Black Music Month. So in doing this today, there's quite a few different ways we could do it, but I thought, I'd just grab a bunch of records off of my record collection, and I'll give you a brief timeline for the development of popular music in America today by talking about some of those significant artists along the way. And I hope you tune in for this entire presentation, and that you just might learn a little bit about why you love music so much. So the beginning point when we think about popular music in America, this is a piece of sheet music from 1914, W.C. Handy's St. Louis Blues. It sold about 1 million copies of sheet music at the time. And the other big seller of sheet music during this World War I era was Jelly Roll Morton. We have to remember that songs like St. Louis Blues by W.C. Handy and Jelly Roll Blues by Jelly Roll Morton, these were songs that the mainstream masses never heard. Unless you knew someone in your neighborhood who had a piano, or somebody who maybe played the guitar and had access to sheet music, you weren't going to hear this music. So the sales of sheet music was huge in the period before radio. And again, it was a great way for people to begin to play this music that would really form the basis for all music in the future. In the 1920s, of course, we have the great Louis Armstrong. He will do a series of recordings with King Oliver in 1920 and 1921, which will really transform the way we listen to music. Louis Armstrong is very significant because of his ability to solo. So now we have a person who can step out of an orchestra, step out of a band, and do a solo, which will inspire countless and I mean countless number of musicians to want to blow the horn like Louis Armstrong. Another of the very popular artists in the 1920s was Bessie Smith, and she does a series of recordings in the 1920s that by the time we have radio in everybody's living room by the mid to late 1920s, the music of jazz is beginning to really push itself into the living rooms and family rooms throughout America. So Bessie Smith and Louis Armstrong were two of the first really big pioneers in musical formats that would become rock and roll and everything else. In the 1930s, of course, we have the great Robert Johnson, the great Robert Johnson laying down his tracks. And in the 1930s, and actually starting a little earlier in the 20s, we have Blind Lemon Jefferson. And Robert Johnson and Blind Lemon Jefferson are very important because not only for their vocal techniques, but their style of playing the guitar, and countless, I mean, we really can't count the number of guitar players who began to work their way through the fretboard and learn how to play the guitar after hearing the music of Blind Lemon Jefferson and Robert Johnson in the 1930s. Of course, in the 1930s, we had swing music was huge. So you had Count Basie, had a great swing band. You had, of course, the great composer Duke Ellington with a wonderful band. And you had bands like Fletcher Henderson. In 1930s, the radio was playing that music live. You could hear a Cotton Club concert, and you could be in Los Angeles or Milwaukee. You didn't have to be in New York. And again, in the 1930s, jazz music really permeated the American airwaves, and bands like Basie's band and Duke Ellington's band featured again these soloists. And as people are listening to a trombone or a trumpet or a saxophone solo, they too are now picking up that instrument and trying to figure out those different riffs and those different melody patterns in order to play the music themselves. And of course, jazz music is the first real American music ever created. 1940s, it's going to change a little bit during the World War II era. We're going to strip down these big orchestras, and people like Charlie Parker will do some great work with the great Dizzy Gillespie in the 1940s, and they will create a music called bop. And bop is going to take that orchestra and it's going to shrink it down to a quartet, a quintet, a sextet. Now you're going to have bands of 4 to 6 people. Each person in the band will be able to play some kind of a musical solo. And certainly the work of Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker and others in the 1940s is going to give way to a whole new slew of musicians in the 1950s. Again, Duke Ellington, the great Duke Ellington with Johnny Hodges, all this music, of course, now being available on phonograph records, on long play records, and listening to it in and over the radio. And of course, we have the great vocalists of the 40s and the 50s, Ella Fitzgerald. Louis Armstrong, certainly known for his trumpet playing, but man, his vocal patterns and vocal techniques certainly influenced multiplicity of vocalists, as did the great Ella Fitzgerald. Some of the other song queens and kings of the time period, we had the great Dinah Washington, the equally great Sarah Vaughan, the equally great Billie Holiday. Again, these vocal stars began to be the blueprint and the pattern for vocalists that were going to follow them in the future. And of course, it's not just jazz music, and there were male jazz singers as well. But I'm just trying to give you little brief history here of the importance of Black musicians and Black music in American culture. One of the great American musical traditions is blues music, and there is a little misnomer that blues music may be just, sad songs, but blues expresses happiness, hope, sorrow, oppression. Many things are part of blues music, but blues music becomes one of these huge formats that is going to change popular music forever. Certainly the recordings of people like Leadbelly He would be one of the first in the late 1940s and the early 1950s to kind of pave the way. And his playing, along with Robert Johnson and Blind Lemon Jefferson, would again establish himself and put together a blueprint for future guitar players. Again, jazz music in the 50s was huge with people like Thelonious Monk, so he's going to work out of the bebop era and move into jazz of the 50s. Of course, the great Miles Davis with arguably the greatest jazz record of all time, Kind of Blue. And out of that band, you have the great John Coltrane on saxophone, and we have the drumming technique of Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. And at the same time that jazz music is becoming very popular in the 1950s, again moving away from the big orchestras into smaller combinations, we do have the vocal groups of the time period like the Ink Spots, which will be really instrumental in doo-wop music and other musical forms in the 50s. And out of that comes, of course, the great Fats Waller, who became a very important early pioneer of what would become, for lack of a better word, American music, growing out of the blues, growing out of jazz music, growing out of the New Orleans sound. Sticking with the blues again, we have in the late 1940s and 50s the great Muddy Waters. And I think, Muddy really was very succinct when he sang the blues had a baby and they called that baby rock and roll. So Muddy Waters, one of the hugely significant figures in popular music, as was the great Howlin' Wolf, the equally great Jimmy Reed. We had one of the three kings, Albert King, Freddie King, and then I've got up here the biography of the third king, B.B. King. And we had musicians like Elmore James, John Lee Hooker, and the great Lightning Hopkins. And all of these people are extremely important in the evolution of music. Again, the blues music of the 50s was really going to be one of those things that was going to set the stage for a lot of stuff that comes after that. The New Orleans sound is going to be explored by the great Professor Longhair, who will give us a new concept and will take us away from the West Coast and the East Coast and Chicago and Kansas City, take us down to New Orleans and give us a whole new flavor of the music. When you think about popular music in America, you have to think about the black church. So it was inside that black church where you would have these preachers leading these congregations, and there would be instruments, and there would be call and response, and there would be these emotional performances by these preachers and the reaction from the crowd. And of course, one of our great gospel singers and spiritual singers of all time, Mahalia Jackson. She was extremely popular and turned a lot of people onto spiritual music and gospel music, as did the great Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Rosetta Tharpe is going to take the music out of the church. She's going to secularize it. Not only a great vocal technique, but my word, what a guitar player. And she is rightfully considered the grandma of rock and roll. She would pave the way. She would inspire countless numbers of guitar players, Chuck Berry and others, in the years that follow. From 1949 to 1959, black music, early R&B, what we called R&B at the time in black music, it was relegated to black radio stations because segregation in America meant that you had white radio stations with the hit parade and you had black radio stations. But these songs were readily available on records for people that were hunting them out. And certainly this period of 1949 to 1959 would be instrumental in every bit of music that comes after that. And again, that's a picture of the great Sister Rosetta Tharpe. We had the early vocal groups like the Platters. Again, they would popularize vocal harmonies. and help us out as we moved into the doo-wop era, and then the vocal stylings of the great Nat King Cole. And what these people are going to do is they're going to open the eyes of the white American listening audience. Music becomes so popular in the post-World War II era that these stars that you would listen to on the radio, and sometimes they didn't even know that they were black, may have thought they were white, but they are going to fall in love with these musical traditions, the musics that they are listening to, and that's really going to help begin to erode some of the rigid structures of segregation that are part of America in this time period. Folk music is going to become huge in the 50s and the 60s, and the great Odetta sings unbelievable number of ballads, was very important in the folk music experience of the 1950s and the 1960s. And then as we move closer towards the 50s, we have the singing stylings of the great Jackie Wilson. We have in Chicago, Leonard Chess is recording a series of records with black musicians. He falls in love with black music. He falls in love with the emotional appeal of black music. And Leonard Chess, of course, one of the architects of what would become rock and roll music. As we move in towards the 1960s, we're talking about the Twist, Chubby Checker, and people like that. But before we got there, of course, we had a lot of stuff that was going on in the 1950s. I'm a little out of chronology here. We have, of course, the great Sam Cooke. I talked about Chubby Checker, but he's going to come actually a little later in 1960, so bear with me. The great Sam Cooke. And then in the 1950s, we had Bo Diddley. Another Bo Diddley record. We have the great Chuck Berry. Can't underscore the importance of Chuck Berry, the great 28 tracks that changed music forever. Another architect of that great change was Little Richard. So you cannot underscore these black musicians and their influence to music. The guys like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and Albert King, and then Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley and Little Richard. These are the guys that are going to create the music that comes long after them. I mean, this rock and roll period, this early period in the 1950s grows out of rhythm and blues music. And Little Richard once famously said, you know, R&B is nothing but real black. And out of that black experience is going to come, of course, the British invasion. And without the British invasion, we really don't have much of the music that we're listening today. So British invasion, again, we wouldn't have the Beatles, we wouldn't have the Rolling Stones, we wouldn't have the Animals, we wouldn't have the Kinks, we wouldn't have Jerry and the Pacemakers, we wouldn't have the Hollies, we wouldn't have the Yardbirds. That means no Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, no Led Zeppelin. We've got no Black Sabbath. We've got nothing if it isn't for this blues music of the 1950s and these rock and roll pioneers of the 1950s paving the way. Those kids in Europe, they gobbled up those American records. And when they came across the shores in the 1960s, they transformed American music forever, which paved the way for countless numbers of different styles and musicians to follow. During this period in the 1950s, the great Etta James, she became one of the first crossover artists of the time period. Crossing over meaning crossing over from black R&B radio to white stream radio. And that was a huge turning point in American music history. If you ever saw the great movie Cadillac Records, Beyonce portrays Etta James, and you want to know where Beyonce's influence in music came, shut your eyes while watching that movie and she sounds just like the great Etta James. Working our way through, of course, you know, can't underscore Ray Charles and what he means to American music. In the early 1960s, we had the girl groups, right? So we had the Ronettes. The Ronettes, that was the favorite band of the Beach Boys. And the favorite song of Brian Wilson was Be My Baby. So he loved that song and listened to it all the time. So you had the Ronettes, you had the Crystals, we had the Marvelettes, we had the Shirelles, and of course we had the Supremes. The Supremes were the only band in the 1960s early period to have more number one songs than the great Beatles. So these girl groups of the early 1960s are going to pave a way for all this pop music that is going to follow in the 1970s and the 1980s. And I'll tell you what, you cannot listen to a Ramones song today without hearing the girl groups from the early 1960s, because after all, we like to call the Ramones a punk band, but they were nothing but a pop band going back to the music that they loved. In the 1960s, music is going to change dramatically. Those great jazz pioneers are going to hook up with a lot of new young musicians like Herbie Hancock and create a music known as fusion. And that fusion is going to pave the way for bands like Steely Dan and all kinds of other experimental progressive rock bands that will follow in the 1970s. Of course, we have the musical stylings of the great Marvin Gaye, Aretha Franklin, and we've got Gladys Knight and the Pips. You've got Dionne Warwick. Now we have the advent of soul music with the late great Otis Redding and his great album, The Dictionary of Soul. And of course, soul music is going to change, and it is going to expand into many other musical traditions. Great songwriter, singer, and composer Curtis Mayfield, also very instrumental in the soul music that comes. Stax Records in Memphis has the great Booker T and the MGs, and out of Stax Music, soul experience in the 1960s and 1970s, we're going to ultimately have funk music and a whole bunch of other stuff. Another great Memphis recording artist was Isaac Hayes, who had a series of records. If you go to the Stax Record Museum in Memphis, you'll see Isaac Hayes's 18 karat gold plated Cadillac. It's a beautiful, beautiful car. At the end of the 60s, of course, music is going to fuse and change once again with the arrival of Jimi Hendrix. And after 1970, if you were a guitar player, you did one of two things with your guitar. You either put it in the closet and never played it again, or you tinkered with it hours and hours and hours. And out of Jimi Hendrix and his guitar mastery is going to come all of those guitar gods of the 1970s and the 1980s. So you can't be a guitar hero in the 70s and the 80s if it wasn't for the great Jimi Hendrix. Again, 1970s, we got the pop music experience. So one of the huge bands of the time, of course, was the Jackson 5. And this was going to, again, be inspirational. Here you have a bunch of young kids. You're hearing them on the radio. You're watching them on television, and it becomes transformative. And how many people wanted to start a band as a youngster after listening to the Jackson 5? Of course, we have the great Stevie Wonder, one of those wonderful artists. We have Sly and the Family Stone, which is really the first integrated rock band who's going to give us a fusion of rock, funk, and jazz. We have, of course, Herbie Hancock, who cut his teeth early on with Miles Davis. So he will inspire a whole new group of people. We have disco music that was huge in the 1970s. You had the Ohio Players. You have Donna Summer. Of course, we have the great Village People. And by the 80s, we are now beginning to take pop music and we are beginning to put rock and roll elements into it. One of the great things about this Bad record is Eddie Van Halen is brought on board to play some guitar solo work. And of course, this will take pop music into a whole completely new direction. So people, what I'm trying to say here is there is no music that we listen to today that has not been derived from Black musical experience in America. From the early sheet music to the jazz of the 1920s and 30s that was spun out across the airways, to the hard bop of the 1940s, the folk blues, the urban blues of the 1950s, the jazz musicians bringing these elements of the orchestra down into these smaller combinations, the rock and roll pioneers of the 1950s, the girl groups of the 1960s, spiritual music, gospel music, all of this music becomes a visceral part of music in the future. And we don't have much of what we have today without what we had from those great Black pioneers. So we're going to celebrate Black History Music Month by listening to just about any kind of music you want, but I hope you're going to put on some Black music because it is the American music. And that's all we have for today. I hope you liked what you heard today and you learned something about the linkage from the past to the music of today, because everything we listen to today is derivative of the Black music experience in America. So that's it. Again, until the next time, be good to yourself, be good to your neighbor, do something kind for a stranger without seeking reward. Don't let the darkness take away your light or the haters get you down. And like always, people, peace, love, and music.
I got the rockin' pneumonia. I need a shot of rhythm and blues. I caught the rolling arthritis sitting down at a rhythm review. I roll over Beethoven, they're rocking in 2 by 2. Well, if you feel it and like it, go get your lover, then reel and rock it. Roll it over, then move on up. Just a try for further, then reel and rock with. Run another roll over.